This story is titled, My Wife Tried to Friend's Cock and Humiliate Me in Public. I exploded and beat him to crap in front of our coworkers, and my revenge was simply stunning. Hey Reddit, I'm John, 24 years old and ambitious as hell. A few months ago, I decided to move to a new city for better opportunities. You know, clean slate and all that jazz. I was excited about the possibilities that awaited me in this new chapter of my life. What I found was indeed a great job, but more importantly, I found a girl. At the time, I genuinely thought she was the love of my life. How wrong I was! She became the one who ruined everything. I moved to this city with such high hopes. I had absolutely no idea that it would lead to the most painful betrayal I've ever experienced. My pen pal Simon lived in this city, and he had always talked enthusiastically about the opportunities in the big city. He convinced me to leave my past behind, promising that life would be brighter, incomes higher, and people more open-minded. Like an idiot, I believed him. Little did I know how completely wrong I was. The city was huge compared to my provincial hometown. I felt utterly lost among endless streets and towering skyscrapers. Sometimes the walls seemed to be pressing in on me, and the countless passers-by didn't give a shit about my existence. Nevertheless, I needed to focus. I was determined to succeed here, to start a new life, to break out of my old routine, to find something more meaningful, no matter the cost. Simon offered me a job at his office. It wasn't bad. Actually, it seemed like the right place for me. The work wasn't too difficult, but it required concentration and perseverance. I gradually got used to the new responsibilities and people, trying my best to fit into the dynamic rhythm of city life. Simon wasn't just a friend, but became my guide in this new world. His advice made me feel more confident, and life in the new city became stable. Still, I felt something was missing. Maybe it was longing for the past, or perhaps for the simpler relationships I had before. One thing I knew for certain, being alone in this massive city was unthinkable. I had to find someone to share this new life with. Little did I know this path would lead to a fatal mistake. Weeks passed, and then I met her, Jessica. She was unlike any woman I'd ever met before. She immediately attracted my eye, making me think that life here might not be so empty after all. I saw something special in her, promises of change that could transform my life. And she really did change it, but not in the way I had imagined. The first weeks at the office left me with mixed feelings. I was grateful to Simon for his help. Without him, I wouldn't have found such a position. Competition for good jobs in this city is absolutely crazy. The work turned out to be harder than I expected, though not because of the responsibilities themselves, but because of the atmosphere. The team seemed busy with their own little worlds that I couldn't penetrate. People walked past me, hardly noticing my presence, as if I were just a shadow. There were no friendly conversations at the coffee machine, no smiles or casual jokes in the hallways. Everyone was immersed in their own affairs. For me, a newbie, it was depressing as hell. I felt like an outsider. This cold reception only increased my doubts. Was it worth giving up my past life for this? I caught glances from colleagues, fleeting but attentive, like they were assessing how long I'd last before giving up and leaving. I tried to do everything perfectly, but every step in this new environment was difficult. The feeling of being under constant surveillance made it hard to concentrate. One evening, after another day filled with small but unpleasant mistakes, Simon invited me to a cafe. We'd been planning this for a while but kept postponing because of work. Despite my overwhelming fatigue, I decided it was a great opportunity to get away from the office environment. Simon had always known how to find the right words when I needed them most. We sat in the cafe, and he immediately noticed something was wrong. I was exhausted and tense, and I couldn't stand it anymore. I shared my feelings with him, talked about how hard the job was, how I felt like an outsider, how there seemed to be an ice wall around me that I couldn't break through. He listened attentively without unnecessary comments, and I felt I could trust him. He was the one who supported my decision to move here, and I needed his advice more than ever now. Simon finally spoke, dispelling my fears with surprising ease. At first, it even irritated me a bit how simple he made it sound. He explained that there was nothing unusual about my sensations. Anyone new to a team feels lost, especially in a big city. He assured me it was normal and that everything would get better with time. He added that most colleagues probably didn't think about me as much as I thought they did. Everyone was busy with their own affairs and careers. No one was deliberately trying to create difficulties for me. But then he mentioned there was one thing that could change my situation. He looked at me with a slight smile, like he knew something I didn't. He suggested that my main problem was that I looked too stressed, too focused on work and making a good impression, not giving myself a chance to relax and feel the rhythm of the place. He convinced me I needed a distraction, and the easiest way was to start a relationship. The city was big and full of people, especially women. He asked if I really thought there was no one who could brighten up my everyday life. I laughed at Simon's suggestion. It sounded frivolous, especially when my mind was still racing with work and all the details I needed to remember and fix. But Simon didn't back down. He suggested I take a closer look at the girls from the office, pointing out that many of them were pretty and young. He said relationships at work could help not only in my personal life, but could also make work less stressful, especially if I found common ground with colleagues. He invited me to look around, saying some of these girls were probably interested in me, even if I didn't notice because I was too busy trying to survive in this new place, missing important moments. I couldn't help but admit his words made sense. Maybe I was too focused on adapting and forgot that life isn't only about difficulties. I started to wonder if Simon was right. Should I pay more attention to the people around me, especially women? I didn't know yet that this advice would lead to a catastrophe I couldn't hide from. The next morning, Simon's words wouldn't leave my head. I tried to concentrate on work, but an inner voice kept telling me that maybe my friend was right. I had become too withdrawn into myself, immersed in thoughts of how to survive and adapt. It seemed I had missed something important in this seething stream of new life, the simple opportunity to enjoy the moments life gives. I had never really considered my colleagues as potential companions, but now this option didn't seem so unrealistic. During the lunch break, I decided to take Simon's advice. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of slight panic and determination. I knew if I didn't take this step now, I would drown in routine again and miss the chance to change something in my life. The break seemed like the perfect time. Almost all office employees had gathered in the cafeteria, sitting at tables, joking and laughing. I stood aside for a moment, watching their carefree conversations. I noticed a group of girls who had attracted my attention before, sitting at one of the tables and chatting animatedly. Their faces were relaxed, their eyes glowing from pleasant communication. I took a deep breath, gathered all my strength, and headed towards them. As I approached, I felt a slight tension in my arms and shoulders. I had already decided not to retreat. Simon's words echoed in my head. No one would judge if I just walked up and started a conversation. It seemed like a small step, but it felt like something huge. I walked up to the table, gathered my thoughts, and began a conversation. It turned out to be easier than I thought. The girls were quite open and friendly, and I felt the tension gradually subside with each word. The conversation began to flow more naturally, and I enjoyed being in their company. Moments when I could forget about work and completely immerse myself in communication seemed almost therapeutic. What struck me most was one girl named Jessica. When she spoke, I seemed to forget about everything around me. Her smile was so sincere that it immediately captivated me. Her features seemed flawless, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. Jessica wasn't only beautiful, but surprisingly pleasant to talk to. Her voice sounded calm with a tinge of lively interest. She asked questions, laughed, and I felt at ease in her company. We talked about various little things, work, films, city events, and I didn't notice how time flew by. When the lunch break came to an end and she said goodbye, Jessica smiled at me. The feeling of warmth emanating from her stayed with me for the rest of the day. I kept catching myself thinking about continuing this conversation. Jessica wasn't just a nice colleague. She seemed like someone who could change the way I thought about life in this cold city. I returned to my desk, finding it difficult to concentrate. Thoughts about Jessica constantly distracted me. Her smile, her voice, her charm, all spinning in my head. I realized this lunch break was more than just a pleasant conversation with colleagues. It was the first step towards something new, perhaps exactly what I'd been missing in recent weeks. I wasn't sure it would lead to something serious, as I wasn't used to building high expectations based on a single conversation. Still, the conversation with Jessica had left a deep impression on me. I felt I wanted to continue this communication, regardless of where it might lead. The main thing was that I had taken the first step. I returned home that evening with a feeling of satisfaction, something new for me. It wasn't just about success at work or professional achievements, but a feeling that I had found something important for myself, something that could fill the emptiness inside. I understood the future was unpredictable, and a lot depended not only on me, but I still hoped this conversation would be the beginning of something more. After that conversation with Jessica at lunch, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her smile and soft voice remained in my head throughout the working day. Every time I tried to concentrate on another task, my thoughts returned to the way she had looked at me. Along with these thoughts came a feeling of anxiety. I realized I couldn't afford to act too openly. Office people are always attentive to what's going on around them, and it's unlikely anyone would pass by without noticing if I began to pay too much attention to Jessica. Rumors spread like wildfire in places like this, and the last thing I wanted was to become a target of office gossip. A question haunted me. How could I improve my relationship with Jessica without attracting too much attention? I didn't want our communication to become a topic of discussion on every corner. Simon would probably have advised something, but he was just getting ready to go on a business trip. The answer to my question came completely unexpectedly. It turned out that every Friday our office had its own ritual, which colleagues jokingly called Office Plankton Day, a time when everyone gets together after work to go to the nearest cafe or bar, celebrate the end of the work week, and relax in an informal atmosphere. Simon had told me about this, and I immediately realized it was an ideal opportunity to get closer to Jessica without arousing suspicion. I decided to discuss this with Simon, and he only encouraged me, advising me not to miss this chance. The only thing that darkened my mood was that Simon himself couldn't go to this meeting, as his business trip was set to begin the very next day. He would be gone for 2 whole weeks. Despite this, he confidently stated that I shouldn't worry, assuring me that this evening could turn out to be successful for me. When Friday arrived, I felt a little nervous. I had agreed to meet colleagues in a cafe after work and deliberately stayed in the office a little longer so everything would go naturally, without unnecessary fuss. My colleagues began to leave their workplaces, and soon we all went to the nearest establishment where we had planned to spend the evening. There were 12 of us in total. At first, we all sat together, joking and discussing the past week. Soon it became clear that such a large number of people created certain difficulties for communication, and conversations began to break down into several separate groups, with everyone finding their own company. Jessica sat a little to the side, quietly watching everything that was happening. This moment seemed ideal to approach her and continue our acquaintance. I sat down next to Jessica and started our conversation with a small joke about how quickly our colleagues had scattered into small groups, barely having time to reach the cafe. Jessica smiled, and that smile again made me forget about everything around us. She turned out to be incredibly easy to communicate with, as if there were no tension or official barriers between us. Soon, we were enthusiastically talking about everything under the sun, from work to completely random topics. She already knew I was a close friend of Simon's, which seemed to soften her attitude towards me even more. She was curious about how we met, so I told her the story of our friendship, which began long ago when we corresponded on various forums, discussing completely random topics. Gradually, our conversation became deeper, and I learned more about Jessica. It turned out that Jessica was from a small town, and her path to this office had been just as difficult as mine. During our conversation, we managed to drink several cocktails, which made the atmosphere even more relaxed. We laughed, discussed films we'd recently watched, and shared our impressions of working in the office. This evening was something completely different than what I could have expected. I felt like we really understood each other. And the longer our conversation continued, the clearer it became that there was something more between us than just casual acquaintance. As the evening began to end, and the noise in the cafe began to die down, we decided to go outside to get some fresh air. At that moment, I realized we had an opportunity to be alone. The streets were practically empty, with only rare cars passing by. The night air was refreshing after the stuffy cafe. We walked side by side, continuing our conversation. I felt there was a special connection between us that didn't require unnecessary words. This moment was special. We looked at each other, and I knew this was not just a casual evening with colleagues. This was the start of something more important to me. Friday evening turned out to be a great opportunity to get to know my colleagues better. As expected, people gathered in the cafe near the office, ready to forget about the hustle and bustle of work and relax after a hard week. I felt a little nervous, because this evening could be an important step not only to communicate with colleagues, but also to spend time with Jessica. I arrived early and took a seat closer to the edge of the table, hoping Jessica would sit nearby. My colleagues began to join in one by one until there were 12 of us. Quite a large group for an ordinary evening in a cafe. At first, everyone stuck together, as often happens at the beginning of such meetings. We joked and discussed work issues, laughing at small problems that had seemed so important during the day. Soon it became obvious that it was almost impossible to keep everyone's attention on one conversation. People began to divide into small groups, everyone finding company to their liking. The evening began to flow more intimately for each such mini-company. I noticed Jessica sitting alone, silently observing what was happening. I saw my chance in this and moved closer to her without attracting the attention of others. I began our conversation with a light joke. Jessica smiled at me again, and that was all it took to make me feel comfortable. We started talking about what was happening around us, about work, and about how quickly people find each other in such situations, dividing into small groups. I remembered my conversation with Simon about relaxing and just letting myself go with the flow. Now, sitting next to Jessica, I realized this was exactly what I needed to do. With every minute of communication with Jessica, I felt the tension accumulated over the week recede. We talked about everything: work, life in the big city, films we'd recently watched. Communication with her was so easy that I didn't even notice how quickly time flew by. Jessica suddenly mentioned she knew about my friendship with Simon. This gave our conversation even more openness. She asked how we met, and I gladly told her about our many years of communication. We met on one of the forums when we were both interested in discussing films and music. At first, it was just correspondence, but then when I decided to move, Simon offered me a job in the office where he already worked. I told her about how difficult it was for me at first, how hard it was to adapt to the new place. But thanks to Simon, I felt I could get back on my feet. Jessica listened with obvious interest. Our conversation soon turned to her story. It turned out she also did not immediately find her place in this city. She moved here several years ago from a small provincial town, and her path was no less difficult. She talked about the difficulties of adaptation, how hard it was for her to find a job and make new friends in the big city. I felt that she and I found a lot in common, which helped me get even closer to her. Time flew quickly. It seemed that the others had almost forgotten about us, immersed in their own small companies. I couldn't tear myself away from Jessica. She wasn't just beautiful. Her intelligence and sense of humor made me admire her even more. Her voice, calm and soft, was soothing, and her thoughts and views on life seemed surprisingly close to mine. When the cafe began to empty and the noise of conversations began to die down, Jessica suggested going outside to get some fresh air. It was a great decision. The night was warm and quiet, and we could calmly continue our conversation away from the bustle of the cafe. We went outside and walked slowly along the deserted street, enjoying the fresh air and silence, which contrasted sharply with the hubbub inside. The street was quiet with only occasional cars passing by. I felt that this was a moment of solitude when some special connection began to emerge between us. Jessica looked relaxed, and her smile now seemed even warmer. We continued talking, but now our conversation was different. Not about everyday things, but about more personal matters, about what was really important to each of us. We talked about life, about dreams, about what each of us wanted to achieve. This evening was more than just a get-together with colleagues. I knew this conversation with Jessica was a turning point. We had become close, and I felt that something more was beginning to emerge between us. This moment was special. I understood that from this day on, our relationship would change. That evening ended in a way I could never have imagined. Jessica and I, standing on the street, exchanging glances and words, suddenly realized something special had arisen between us. In the silence of the night, under the light of street lamps, I felt the tension between us disappear, giving way to something deeper. Without saying a word, we came closer to each other, and the evening ended with a kiss. I couldn't believe it had happened. Everything I had dreamed about in recent days suddenly became an unforgettable reality. We kissed, and it seemed like the world around us froze. It was so unexpected, and at the same time so natural. I knew that now everything would be different. But if right now I could go back in time, I would stop communicating with her without waiting for her to cheat. The next morning, I woke up feeling euphoric. Memories of the previous evening came flooding back, and I couldn't stop thinking about Jessica. I lay in bed, analyzing every detail, her smile, her laugh, the way she looked at me at that moment. But after a short moment of joy, another feeling came over me. I needed to prepare for our next meeting. We had scheduled an evening meeting right there on the street when we said goodbye, and we agreed to meet again the next day. This made me a little nervous. I understood that now everything had become more serious, and I wanted to be at my best. Before heading to the meeting, I decided it was worth freshening up my appearance a little. I headed to the barber shop to clean myself up. As I sat in the chair and the hairdresser worked on my haircut, I thought about how this day could be a new beginning. New city, new job, new relationship. All these seemingly random events suddenly began to form into one whole picture. Perhaps this meeting with Jessica was exactly what I'd been missing lately. I felt this was not just flirting, not just infatuation, but something more significant. By evening, I was ready. Jessica and I had agreed to meet in the city center, take a walk, and enjoy the evening air. I knew this time it would no longer be just a friendly meeting. From the moment we kissed, our relationship had moved to the next level. I felt like it was the start of something bigger. I arrived at the meeting place, and Jessica was already waiting for me. Her smile lit up the evening, and I immediately felt comfortable. We went for a walk, chatting about small things, but now our communication seemed much more personal and deeper. We walked along quiet streets, talking about everything in the world, enjoying the light evening breeze. We passed parks, small cafes, and street musicians, creating a special atmosphere of the city. Our conversations touched on a variety of topics: work, future, dreams. I learned more about Jessica this evening than in the entire time we had met before. She turned out to be a person with whom I could talk endlessly. Her thoughts and views on life coincided with mine. I understood that with every step, we were getting closer. The evening passed in one breath. I still remember that I didn't even notice how time flew by. We laughed, discussed plans for the future, and I felt that from that moment, our relationship began to become more and more serious. At some point, we stopped again, and everything that had happened earlier seemed to repeat itself. The same spark that had made us kiss arose between us again. This kiss was already different, not accidental but conscious, full of meaning and expectations. After this evening, I realized that everything had changed. Jessica had become part of my life. I could no longer imagine what would happen if we stopped communicating. Our relationship developed rapidly. From that day, we began to spend more and more time together. We met almost every evening, walked, went to cafes, and discussed work and plans for the future. She became the person I was looking for without even realizing it. Jessica and I were on the same page. I felt like our relationship was growing every day. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I was sure of one thing. I was ready to move on and develop this relationship without looking back. 2 weeks passed since Simon left on his business trip. During this time, my life changed dramatically. My relationship with Jessica had taken a serious turn. We spent almost every free minute together. It became something of a ritual. In the evening, we walked around the city, discussed our everyday life, laughed. And what spoke of our sincerity and openness to each other was that even then, we were building small plans for the future. She became an integral part of my life. I began to realize that this relationship was truly important to me. When Simon returned, I felt that the first thing I had to do was share my joy with him. We agreed to meet at one of the bars where we used to go regularly to discuss how the 2 weeks had gone for both of us. This was a familiar ritual for us, talking about everything, drinking beer, and discussing the latest events. I arrived at the bar early, which gave me time to think about how everything had changed during these weeks. Just recently, I was just a newbie in the office, reserved and alien among colleagues. Now, I was in a serious relationship with Jessica. Simon was the one who had pushed me to take this step, and I knew he would be happy to hear how it all worked out. When Simon finally walked in, he looked tired but happy. We greeted each other, ordered drinks, and fell into conversation. For the first few minutes, Simon talked about his journey, how he had to work with a new team, how he adapted to a different office, that he had interesting meetings and even unexpected discoveries. His story was full of small details that seemed important to him. I listened to him with interest, but I couldn't wait to share my news. When he finally finished his story, it was my turn. I decided to get straight to the point. Taking a deep breath, I said that I had great news. I told him that everything was very serious with Jessica, that over these 2 weeks our relationship had become almost inseparable. I described with real delight our walks, our conversations, how we became closer every day, and how happy I felt next to her. But as soon as I mentioned Jessica's name, I noticed that Simon seemed to freeze for a moment. His face became more reserved, and he became quiet. His attention seemed to wander for a while. Then, realizing that I was still talking, he returned to the conversation and supported me, but his reaction still seemed a little strange. He nodded and smiled, but something in his gaze made me wonder. This was not the usual expression of joy that I was accustomed to from him. He praised me and said he was happy for us, that this was great news. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind that smile. something he didn't want to talk about. At that moment, I could not understand what was causing his reaction. I was definitely sure that there was some reason why he supported me differently than I expected. Still, I was too careless. I decided to ignore this moment and did not ask whether something was bothering him. I didn't ask any more questions, deciding that perhaps it was just his fatigue after the long journey. We continued our conversation, but this time it seemed more superficial. I was still thinking about that moment when his reaction seemed not entirely natural to me. Something was bothering me, but I couldn't figure out exactly what. At the end of the evening, we said our goodbyes. Simon left, saying that we would see him in the office soon. I was left alone, pondering his strange reaction. When Simon returned to work after his business trip, his mood seemed to improve. He was full of energy, as if this trip had given him new strength. He told me that he had gained valuable experience working with the new team and had even completed a short internship for a management position. He shared his plans to lead our department as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Simon had always been ambitious, and now I saw in him even more determination and desire to move forward. In turn, my life now revolved around two things: work and Jessica. We continued to meet every day after work. She showed me the city, shared stories about her life, and I became more and more interested in her. Every evening was filled with conversation, laughter, and long walks. It seemed almost perfect. I felt like I had found someone I could spend many years with. Everything seemed so natural and right that I couldn't believe my luck. At work, everything also went as usual. I tried to stay focused on my responsibilities, although my thoughts often wandered to Jessica. But every time I saw Simon, his slightly reserved reaction to my stories still bothered me. It seemed that something in his look and behavior hinted at something more than just friendly support, but he never said anything directly. I didn't want to bring it up. However, I was full of optimism. My job gave me stability, and Jessica was like a child's joy of victory for me. I was ready for new stages of my life. Simon, in turn, became completely immersed in his ambitious career, seeking advancement. Every time we talked, he mentioned his plans to become a manager and head the department. I could see that he was really determined. This made me happy. My friend was moving forward, and I also had every reason to be happy for him. This quiet life could not last forever, but at that time, I could not even think about it. Over time, I began to notice something strange that had previously escaped my attention. This applied not only to Jessica, but also to Simon. It all started from those very evenings when Jessica and I began to communicate closely. At first, it seemed that everything was going perfectly in my life, but gradually little details began to emerge, making me think about things I tried not to notice. It all started when I first noticed Simon and Jessica together in an informal setting. Until that moment, their presence next to each other seemed to me something ordinary. I saw no reason to be suspicious, because both Simon and Jessica were close people to me. But recently, something had changed. There was something in their behavior that caught my attention. This became especially noticeable when the three of us found ourselves in the office kitchen during breaks. That day started as usual. Simon and I were working on a project, then decided to take a short break. I suggested calling Jessica, and Simon didn't mind, but his reaction seemed a little reserved. The three of us went to the kitchen, where we started making coffee and chatting about the latest affairs. However, I soon began to notice that the conversation between them seemed strained. Simon was usually open and sociable, but now he seemed somehow distant. Jessica was also less talkative than usual. They both avoided looking each other in the eyes. Their sentences were short and formal. This alarmed me a little, but I decided not to dwell on it. Maybe they were just tired or couldn't find the right topics to talk about. But when I went to the toilet and returned a few minutes later, the scene I saw made me think even more. When I returned to the kitchen, they were sitting opposite each other, but not talking. Both were immersed in their phones, as if they were not interested in anything else. It seemed strange because I was used to seeing Simon talkative, especially in company, and now there was complete silence. It seemed that without me, there was no communication left between them. This silence was heavy. It hung in the air like something inexplicable. When I entered the kitchen, they both looked up and smiled at me as if nothing had happened. I felt like something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. These small details, this tension in their behavior, began to bother me, but I decided not to ask unnecessary questions. Perhaps all this was just a figment of my imagination. After all, Jessica was the one I loved, and Simon was my friend. However, this moment could not leave my mind. The more I thought about it, the stronger my feeling of anxiety became. I kept asking strange questions. What could have happened between them? And why did they act as if there was some kind of invisible wall between them? I knew that sooner or later I would have to deal with this, but for now, I could not allow myself to think that something was seriously wrong. However, deep down, I began to sense something was coming. Internal anxiety had not left me from the moment I noticed the strange behavior of Simon and Jessica in the office kitchen. My thoughts constantly returned to that incident, to that heavy silence that hung between them. I tried to push away the anxiety, but the more I thought about it, the stronger the feeling became that something was escaping my attention. A week passed. The following Saturday, I decided that it was time to finally figure out what I had not previously attached much importance to. I called Simon and suggested we meet at the same bar where we usually discussed everything important. This time, I was determined to find out what was really going on. When we met, Simon was, as usual, friendly and relaxed. We ordered a glass of beer and started talking about business, as always. But this feeling gnawed at me. In the end, I could not stand it. Trying to find the right words, I conveyed to him that I had noticed some strange behavior between him and my girlfriend. I said that they both behaved with restraint, especially when they were together. After that, I asked directly if there was anything I didn't know about yet. Simon looked at me with mild surprise. Then a hint of what I thought was embarrassment flashed across his face. He took a sip of beer, hesitated for a couple of seconds, then replied that he had been unable to decide to have this conversation for a long time. He didn't know if he really intended to keep it secret any longer if it weren't for my suspicions. But as it turned out, he and Jessica had known each other for a long time. According to him, he did not want to mention it earlier so as not to create inconvenience. As it turned out in the distant past, back when they were studying at university, they had a short affair, which he did not consider serious. According to him, it was only for a few months, after which their paths diverged. They stopped communicating immediately from that time. The fact that they ended up in the same company was an unpleasant accident for him, which he was embarrassed to tell about earlier. His words, on one hand, put everything in its place. This explained the reserve that I saw between them. They were just exes. I was well aware that this could happen, especially in such a big city. You meet someone once, and then their paths cross again, but under different circumstances. I nodded, trying to comprehend everything I had heard. When I asked him why he didn't really talk about it at the moment he heard about my interest, Simon simply shrugged. After taking a few more sips of beer, he looked away and said that he didn't want this to somehow affect our relationship. He said that it was a long time ago and didn't matter, adding that he was happy for us and that she was a good girl. He expressed confidence that we would suit each other. It seemed that he simply did not want this past to somehow interfere with Jessica's and my future. His words sounded convincing. At first glance, there was nothing suspicious in them. He spoke calmly and confidently, as he always did when he wanted to show that everything was okay. For a moment, I felt relieved. Everything seemed to have such a simple explanation as if it were really a past that remained in the past. We've all faced similar situations, but something still bothered me. Maybe it was my gut feeling. Maybe it was intuition. But I decided not to go deeper. I believed that Simon was honest. His words sounded sincere. At that moment, I had no reason to doubt his support. Trying to return to the previous conversation, I replied that I was glad that he told me this, that now everything was falling into place. There was even hope that our relationship would not cause any inconvenience between them. In response, Simon smiled and said that there was no need to worry because everything would be fine since they both had left it in the past. This ended our conversation. We returned to discussing ordinary things, work, plans for the future. But now, knowing that they had a brief affair in the past, I felt that it was not so simple. Maybe I was just overly anxious. Maybe it was just my fear of losing Jessica. But I was wrong, and this mistake cost me much more than I could have imagined. Several months passed. It seemed that life had returned to normal again. My relationship with Jessica remained stable, work moved forward, and everything that seemed strange earlier was gradually forgotten. Simon went back to his work, and I concentrated on daily tasks. However, events began to occur on the horizon that changed the usual course of things. There was news of changes in the office. Our department head was preparing to transfer to another position. This caused unrest among the staff. The vacant boss position looked like a golden opportunity for Simon. He was ambitious and purposeful and had long strived to climb the career ladder. When the rumors were confirmed and it became clear that the position would indeed be open, Simon immediately took action. He began to develop a presentation plan to present his candidacy to the company's management. This was an important moment for him. He turned to me for help, knowing that I was well-versed in presentations and preparation, areas which were not his strong suit. Together, I believed we could create the perfect proposal. I happily agreed to help him. Over the next few weeks, we worked side by side, perfecting every detail of the presentation. Simon was full of enthusiasm and energy, discussing ideas, plans, and possible steps to take him to the position of chief. I put all my effort into this project, knowing how important it was for my friend. However, during this period, I began to notice some strange behavior in Jessica. She became more distant. We used to spend almost every free minute together, but now she began to find reasons not to meet so often. Either she had things to do, or some urgent meetings with friends, or she just wanted to be alone. I tried not to pay too much attention to it, chalking it up to the fact that people sometimes need personal space. But that was just the beginning. Jessica became more irritable, especially when I suggested spending the evening together or discussing how our day went. Her answers became short. I noticed that her gaze often wandered away from mine. This was unlike her. Previously, she had always been open and attentive, but now it was as if something had changed, as if an invisible wall had appeared between us. One of the most striking moments was that she increasingly stayed at work late into the night. I offered to meet her after such delays, but she refused each time, finding excuses that sounded less and less plausible. I understood that the office was always full of work, but I had a strong feeling that it was not only that. However, my relationship with Simon still seemed strong. We often discussed his candidacy for the new position, how he planned to run the department, and what changes he would like to make. There was nothing suspicious in his behavior. I was sincerely happy for my friend, whose career advancement seemed almost inevitable. But still, these strange things with Jessica haunted me. I kept thinking that maybe I was exaggerating, or maybe this was all just a temporary problem that would pass. But my inner voice told me that these were not just little things. For the first time in a long time, I felt insecure in my relationship with her. This anxious feeling began to remind itself more and more often. It had been a few months since Jessica and I's lives seemed perfect. I tried not to pay attention to minor oddities in her behavior, attributing everything to temporary difficulties. However, lately, it began to seem to me that something had changed between us. This feeling was subtle, like a slight taste of bitterness, which gradually became more and more noticeable. Typically, Friday evenings were a time when our office employees would gather at a cafe after work. It had become a tradition, a kind of relaxation after a week of work. At such moments, it always seemed to me that the world around was returning to its usual harmony. Jessica and I usually went to these meetings together, but that evening, something went wrong. On Friday morning, Jessica told me that she planned to go to the meeting separately because she had some urgent business that she had to deal with by the end of the day. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes these things happen, and I'm used to trusting her. We agreed to meet at the cafe later. I walked her to work, wished her a good day, and went about my business. Simon was also busy. He and I were discussing the final details of his presentation for the position of department head. I noticed that he was in unusually high spirits. He literally glowed with confidence, as if he knew that this was just a formality and his promotion was a done deal. We also agreed to meet in the evening, but he said that he would not be able to come on time due to business meetings. This was not unusual. Simon was always overworked. In the evening, I went to the cafe where my colleagues had already begun to gather. The atmosphere was pleasant. There was music playing, and the usual jokes and conversations about how the work week went filled the air. But something about this evening seemed different to me. I tried not to dwell on it, but an inner feeling of unease did not go away. Time passed, but Jessica was still not there. I checked my phone and saw that there were no messages or calls from her. At first, I thought that she was just late at work, as had happened before. I decided not to bother her, but then I started to notice that Simon wasn't there either. He didn't show up, although a lot of time had passed since we agreed to meet. A feeling of anxiety crept inside me. Although I did not want to admit it, thoughts began to gather in my head in the form of suspicions. Could this be just a coincidence? Maybe they were both just caught up in their work? But the longer they did not appear, the stronger this uneasy feeling became. I tried to distract myself by carrying on conversations with my colleagues, but my thoughts kept returning to Jessica and Simon. Their absence became too noticeable. It was a strange coincidence that the two people I had been closest to in recent months suddenly disappeared on the same evening. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I went outside to get some fresh air and try to calm down. The evening was cool and a light wind cooled my face, but this did not help to get rid of my anxiety. I checked my phone again, hoping to see a message from Jessica, but there was none. A variety of thoughts began to arise in my head. Could something bad have happened? Or perhaps she just had unforeseen circumstances. Then I remembered Simon's words that he would have a business meeting. But what if it was more than just a meeting? What if something was happening behind my back this whole time, and I was too blind to notice? All those little oddities that I tried to ignore now seemed much more significant to me. Returning to the cafe, I tried to return to the usual flow of conversation with my colleagues, but I could not get rid of the growing feeling of suspicion. Time passed, and neither Jessica nor Simon showed up. I decided to call Jessica, but her phone was unreachable. It was strange. Usually she always answered, even if she was busy. My anxiety peaked when one of my colleagues, Rick, came up to me. He started chatting about all sorts of small things. He and I had never been particularly close, but his conversation distracted me from my anxious thoughts for a while. However, it was he who accidentally gave me the very key to understanding what I was so afraid of. Trying to be friendly, he said that he had recently seen my girlfriend, saying that she was so bright. It was difficult not to notice her. Hearing this, I froze. Trying not to show my excitement, I asked when he saw her and where. He replied that it happened recently, just last week in an establishment not far from the office. Suddenly he stopped, realizing that he was saying something that I might not like. It turned out that I understood his behavior correctly because then he shocked me with his words. He revealed that she was actually in the company of a man. At that moment, my heart began to beat much faster. I felt a shortness of breath. After that, I heard that it seemed to him that she and that guy looked quite close. These words pierced me like a sharp knife. My head was spinning. I couldn't concentrate on what Rick was saying next. I tried to hold on, but everything inside began to crumble. I remembered all the times Jessica had been distant, her frequent delays at work, her refusal to meet me in the evenings. Now it all seemed too obvious. Rick, noticing that his words had caused a storm of emotions in me, fell silent awkwardly and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. A clear picture of what was happening behind my back all this time began to form in my head. I tried to push these thoughts away, but they only intensified. Returning to the cafe, I realized that I could no longer be there. I apologized to my colleagues and left, leaving them bewildered. Everything was seething inside me: resentment, anger, bewilderment. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing. What I learned today would change everything. The moment came faster than I expected. Simon was preparing for his biggest presentation. The presentation we prepared together was his key to success, or at least that's what he thought. I knew this day would change everything for him, for me, and for Jessica. The revenge I had so carefully planned was about to be fulfilled. When morning came, I felt strangely calm. Every step I took was thought out. Every edit in the presentation was made in such a way as to cause maximum confusion for Simon. He was ready to present himself to management as the best candidate for the position of head of department. There was an atmosphere of anticipation in the office. All employees were looking forward to his speech. For many, Simon was the obvious choice. I knew his confidence was genuine. We met with him shortly before the start of the presentation. Simon was calm, his face reflecting complete confidence and success. I wished him luck, and he thanked me for my help, not even suspecting that his next few minutes would be a real disaster. I knew that in a few moments his whole life would change. My revenge would be accomplished. When Simon took the stage and began his speech, everything went according to plan. He spoke about his achievements, about how he saw the development of the department. His confidence was conveyed to the audience. But when the moment came for the key slide, I noticed his expression change. He froze, his gaze skimming over the words I had added at the last moment. In that moment, his confidence evaporated. Panic slowly began to overwhelm him. He began to stutter as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing on the screen. There was, among other things, a phrase he never expected to see. The slide said that he stole a girl from his good friend. These words that I wrote into his presentation hit him like a hammer. The hall froze. People began to look at each other, not understanding what was happening. Simon tried to continue, but his voice was shaking, and he lost track of his words. Trying to justify himself, he began to panic more and more. At some point, he simply could not stand it. Without finishing the presentation, he left the stage to whispers and surprised looks from the audience. I watched him from the side. A strange feeling of satisfaction grew inside me. Everything happened exactly as I had planned. Simon, previously confident of his triumph, was destroyed before the eyes of those who saw him as a potential leader. He could not cope with the shame and quit immediately after this situation. He decided to transfer to another city so as not to have to deal with the consequences of his failure, to avoid the talking behind his back. His departure was quick and silent. Soon the office stopped talking about him, and I, remaining behind the scenes of this drama, continued to work on my tasks. But over the next few days, I began to notice changes in Jessica's behavior. She realized that something had changed. Her usual indifference towards me gave way to anxiety and suspicion. She began to look back at me more often, as if she expected me to say something that would completely ruin her life. But I didn't do it. My revenge was complete. I didn't need to point out her mistakes again. A few weeks after Simon left, I myself found myself among the candidates for the position of head of department. Everyone knew that Simon was the main contender, but now that he was gone, my name became a household name. Management appreciated my work, and soon I received what I was unofficially heading for, the position that should have belonged to Simon. Jessica couldn't bear the changes. Her position in the office became precarious. She felt that her relationship with Simon no longer gave her privileges. Her gaze became empty when she realized that I was now her boss. A few months later, she left, simply writing a letter of resignation. I didn't stop her. I didn't ask unnecessary questions because she chose her path, and it led her to this. After everything that happened, I felt like my life was finally starting to come together. The revenge I had so carefully planned brought me at least some joy. I no longer felt deceived or used. On the contrary, I gained new meaning. The void that betrayal left began to be filled with something new, a sense of strength and control over my own life. My life had changed. Now I was the one who controlled my destiny, not the one who was manipulated. I couldn't say that I was completely happy. The consequences of those events left traces that could not be erased. But I knew one thing. I was no longer the kind of person who let others control my destiny. Revenge gave me back control. And in the chaos, I found a new, albeit bitter, form of happiness.